So, the Battle of Agincourt is probably the most famous battle in medieval history, at least in the United States and the English-speaking world. And that's for pretty obvious reasons. It is a stunning victory that is won by perhaps the most famous warrior king in English history against their most standard rival. And further, it's coming right at the end of the Middle Ages. But to start with some context, the Battle of Agincourt is fought as one of the many battles within the Hundred Years' War, and it is specifically the beginning of Henry V's involvement in it. Henry V is a pretty prolific warrior king. The start of his reign, England is in chaos, and France is finally starting to push the English out of the mainland. Henry V, by the time he comes to power, though, he puts down most of the opposition revolts, and by comparison, the French King Charles VI is going mad, meaning that a lot of government is left in the hands of his various siblings. One person of note should be the royal constable, Charles d'Albret. What matters is France is weak of leadership, and England is under the leadership of a skilled general. Henry V opens negotiations with France. He demanded basically all the land that they had lost to the French at some point or another. Obviously, the French rejected, so Henry V gathers up his army and crosses the Channel. He ends up in a siege of a city called Harfleur, which was way longer than he wanted it to. He started the siege in the early campaigning season, and it ends up going on until pretty much the entire campaigning season. The siege, I believe, lasts until September. He loses thousands of troops, and by the time he's done, it's the middle of autumn. If you know anything about medieval European combat, you really can't be fighting past September at the latest. And so this is obviously bad news. It's taken him an entire campaigning season, and he's only got one city, which is not good. His options are either return to England, having basically failed, stay in France and starve, or retreat to Calais. Calais being a small English stronghold on the French coastline. It's north of Normandy. In between Harfleur and Calais is the River Somme, and at this point the French army had successfully gathered up forces. So, as Henry V is marching along the Atlantic coastline, General Charles d'Albret, the guy who I mentioned before, has gathered up a French military and places it along the River Somme. His goal is to try and make sure that the English cannot, I believe, ford across the river without facing a French attack. Henry V decides the most effective solution is to just go south, and eventually he just goes around the French military, because, as we know, French people don't know how to move, apparently. At this point, it's basically a race to Calais. There's nothing in between England and their retreat to a city where they'll be able to gather up food. The English troops march as fast as they can to the city of Calais, but the French reach them first. The two end up in an area that it's not exactly a valley, but it can kind of be seen like that. It's a lowland area that's incredibly muddy and apparently freshly plowed in between two higher up hill areas covered in woods and forests. The French are on one side of this valley, and the English are on the other. Let's compare the forces of these two going into battle. Now, exact numbers are hotly debated, but we do have a general idea of who had what. The English military had a very small number of knights, just over 1,000, some theories, but and none of these knights were on horseback. And in comparison, they had, the numbers I found stated something like 7,000, again, hotly debated, but something like 7,000 archers. There was no cavalry, there was no artillery, and it doesn't look like there was any crossbowmen either on the English side. Compare that to the French military. There were much more French knights deployed. There was likely several thousand, the exact numbers are debated, but there was also a massive amount of cavalry and a smaller but non-zero amount of longbowmen and crossbowmen, both. And furthermore, also remember, the French military is less exhausted, much more well-fed, and the English military at this point is suffering dysentery. So the English are in very ragged condition right now, while the French outnumber them in terms of troops you can really deploy in combat, and outnumber them in terms of healthy troops. No, the French have, as far as we can tell, every advantage. Henry V obviously knows his army is in much worse condition than the French. So, the most logical option is actually to attack first, because waiting for any longer, the English troops were only going to get hungrier and more diseased. So, he lines his troops up and sends them into the middle of the valley. Specifically, the way he had it worked is that his troops were so low in numbers, he could only make a single line of troops stretching across the length of this sort of valley thing. This line of troops was a mixture of archers and knights, with more archers on each of the edges. Remember those wooded hill things I mentioned before? Each of those has a group of archers hidden within them. From there, he sends all of his troops to march forward closer to the French lines. Eventually, once they're within range of their longbows, they begin pelting the French cavalry, specifically to try and get the cavalry to attack. So the cavalry charges, and the English had two things on their side. Firstly, they placed down a bunch of stakes, which obviously stopped the cavalry's advance. But then the other thing they do is they just have archers, and the archers really do start kind of really severely damaging this cavalry. Archers are better than cavalry in two ways. One, longbowmen at this point could punch through knightly armor, so they actually could kill a knight, but two, they can knock someone off their horse. And so this cavalry charge eventually is beaten back by the English, the cavalry breaks, and this is the moment when the French infantry is actually able to start advancing. So the French infantry, the first line of the French infantry, the French are in 3 lines, the first line begins advancing, and they are having a terrible time. They're being pelted with arrows, they're walking through the thick mud that I mentioned earlier, which is slowing their advance, especially because most of them are heavily armored, and they are marching through the retreating cavalry, which causes just total chaos in the French lines. Eventually they hit the English lines, and the combination of their ragged position combined with the amount of English archers means that this advance is not going as well as it should. To further compound the problem, the second French line, which is the largest one, also advances behind the first one, and this doesn't actually help. It ends up crushing the first line and second line together, which induces more chaos and further disorganizes the attack. The English continue to pelt the French with arrows, continue to fight off. Somewhat famously, Henry V has a piece of his crown cut off because of how intense the fighting got, but the French break and retreat. From this point, the things kind of play out pretty quickly. The English capture a bunch of troops. They end up actually killing pretty much every single one of their prisoners of war because they were afraid of a prison revolt, and the French retreat. So what was the importance of the Battle of Agincourt? The Battle of Agincourt, in terms of its actual results, are not important. The English don't take territory in this battle. They retreat through Calais immediately after and go back to England victorious, but without actually having gained much. What actually matters about the battle is the battle itself. The archers that fought in this battle were perhaps some of the first times in European history in which archers were beating heavy armor and heavy cavalry. For all of European history, armored knights on horseback were the trump card of every battle, and this was true pretty much everywhere, actually. Soldiers on cavalry were just the best divisions you could have. This changed that. In the Battle of Agincourt, the longbow proves to be confirmably able to kill a knight, and confirmably able to destroy a cavalry charge. This is the beginning of projectile warfare, something that will eventually develop into combat with muskets that, of course, leads into modern-day warfare where all fighting is done with firearms. However, the thing I personally find more interesting about the Battle of Agincourt is how the archers in question were recruited. The archers were not recruited the traditional feudal way, where you'd have a feudal lord who trained for his entire life to be a soldier for his lord. Instead, archers were actually lowborn. They were pretty much average people who were required to, every Sunday, go out and practice archery. So, as a result, this is really one of the first battles where we see a military not recruited from the elites with a couple peasants brought along to help them fight. This is when we start seeing battles that really were using common soldiers and using people who were there because they were skilled, not because they were born to be warriors.